The British interrogation room in Dover smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. Captain James Wheeler of the Intelligence Corps had interviewed 47 escaped prisoners in the past month alone. Most brought nothing useful, just horror stories and vague observations about German troop movements. Wheeler expected nothing different from the gaunt Frenchman sitting across the wooden table on this humid morning of June 14th, 1943. The man had introduced himself as René Mautaint, a civil engineer from Lyon, captured during the fall of France in 1943. Years of captivity had hollowed his face and turned his hair prematurely grey, but his eyes retained an unsettling intensity. Wheeler had developed instincts about prisoners. Some exaggerated their experiences, desperate for attention or advantage. Others minimized their suffering, too traumatized to articulate what they'd endured. Mautaint was different. He sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, waiting with an engineer's patience for Wheeler to begin the standard question. Wheeler opened his notepad and began the routine. Name, rank, unit, date of capture, camps of imprisonment. Mautaint answered each question precisely, providing details that could be verified through Red Cross records. Born 1908, educated at École Centrale, Paris, commissioned as second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, captured at Sedan in May 1940. The story was unremarkable until Wheeler asked about work assignments. Mautaint's expression changed subtly. This is where most prisoners became vague, either because they genuinely didn't know where they'd been or because they feared retribution against fellow prisoners still in captivity. But Mautaint leaned forward slightly and said something that made Wheeler's pen stop mid-sentence. "I need to draw something for you." The request was unusual enough that Wheeler paused. Prisoners occasionally sketched maps of camp layouts or supply routes, but something in Mautaint's tone suggested this was different. Wheeler pushed his notepad across the table. Mautaint studied the blank page for a long moment, then began drawing with steady, confident strokes. What emerged over the next 20 minutes was unlike anything Wheeler had seen in 3 years of intelligence work. The sketch showed massive concrete structures, geometric patterns that seemed architecturally impossible, and at the center, a cylindrical object with dimensions that defied logic. Mautaint worked with absolute concentration, occasionally closing his eyes as if visualizing something, then adding another detail. He drew in cross-section and elevation, using techniques that revealed his engineering training. When he finally set down the pen, Wheeler stared at the drawing with complete incomprehension. The structures were enormous, clearly industrial or military, but their purpose was inscrutable. The cylindrical object at the center was particularly baffling. Mautaint had drawn it with careful proportional accuracy, 14 meters tall according to the scale notations, tapering toward one end like a massive artillery shell. Wheeler had seen German military installations in reconnaissance photographs. This resembled nothing in his experience. "Where was this?" Wheeler asked, keeping his voice neutral. Mautaint met his eyes directly. "Peenemünde, the island of Usedom. Baltic coast. I was there for 11 months from April 1942 to March 1943. Wheeler had heard the name Peenemünde in intelligence briefings. Photographic reconnaissance had identified unusual construction activity there, but analysts couldn't determine the site's purpose. The installations were too large for conventional weapons testing, too elaborate for simple military barracks. Some speculated it was a chemical weapons facility. Others thought it might be related to radar development. None of the theories quite fit the available evidence, and this, Wheeler indicated the cylindrical object. "What is this?" Mautaint's response came quietly but with absolute certainty. "A rocket, a flying bomb. The Germans are building weapons that can reach London from the European mainland. No aircraft, no bomber crews, just rockets carrying tons of explosives traveling faster than sound." René Mautaint's journey to Peenemünde had begun with bureaucratic randomness that characterized the Nazi system of forced labor. In April 1942, he was one of 40 French prisoners of war selected from Stalag Chathy A near Torun in occupied Poland. The selection criteria were never explained, but Mautaint suspected his engineering background had flagged him in some administrative file. The Germans were meticulous about tracking prisoner skills, cataloging engineers, mechanics, and technicians for potential exploitation. The transport north took 3 days, packed into cattle cars with minimal food and water. Guards provided no information about their destination or purpose. This secrecy alone was unusual. Most work details involved construction, farming, or factory labor. Assignments the Germans saw no reason to conceal. The elaborate security surrounding this particular transport suggested something different. When the train finally stopped and prisoners were ordered out, Mautaint found himself on an island that seemed designed to isolate its inhabitants from the world. Usedom sat in the Baltic Sea, connected to the mainland by a single bridge heavily guarded by Wehrmacht and SS troops. The northern section of the island was restricted military territory, fenced with barbed wire and patrolled by guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave without authorization. The installation itself was vast, stretching along the coast for miles. Mautaint saw immediately that this was no ordinary military base. The scale of construction dwarfed anything he'd encountered. Massive concrete structures rose from the landscape, some still under construction, others already operational. What struck him most was the precision. German military engineering was famously meticulous, but Peenemünde represented something beyond normal standards. Every structure was built to tolerances that suggested extraordinary technical requirements. The prisoners were housed in a separate compound, isolated from the main facility by additional fencing and guard posts. They were forbidden from speaking with German workers or scientists. Any prisoner caught attempting communication faced immediate execution. The rules were enforced with brutal consistency. During Mautaint's first week, a Polish prisoner was shot for asking a German technician a question about tool specifications. The message was clear. Prisoners existed solely to provide manual labor. Curiosity was a capital offense. Mautaint's work assignment involved constructing launch platforms, massive concrete pads designed to withstand enormous force. The engineering specifications were extraordinary. Reinforced concrete foundations extended meters into the earth. Steel reinforcement used grades normally reserved for bridge construction. The platforms incorporated cooling channels, exhaust deflectors, and mounting points for equipment whose purpose Mautaint could only guess. He worked alongside German civilian contractors who possessed specialized knowledge about the facility's purpose but were forbidden from discussing it. The contractors were themselves watched constantly by SS security personnel, ensuring no information leaked. Despite these precautions, Mautaint began piecing together fragments of understanding. The sheer scale of the launch platform suggested they were designed to support something with tremendous weight and power. The exhaust deflectors implied rocket motors of unprecedented size. The cooling channels indicated extreme heat loads. As a civil engineer, Mautaint could calculate structural requirements from the specifications he was implementing. Whatever these platforms were designed to launch weighed approximately 12 to 15 tons and generated thrust measured in tens of thousands of kilograms. 3 months into his imprisonment at Peenemünde, Mautaint witnessed something that transformed his fragmented understanding into terrifying comprehension. He was working on Platform 7, pouring concrete for reinforcement, when a convoy of specialized transport vehicles approached the adjacent test area. The convoy moved with elaborate security, escorted by SS troops who cleared all prisoners from sight lines, but Mautaint, positioned on scaffolding 20 meters above ground level, had an unobstructed view as the convoy stopped and German technicians began unloading their cargo. What emerged from the transport vehicle looked like something from science fiction literature. A cylindrical object 14 meters long, painted in black and white test pattern markings, was carefully maneuvered onto a horizontal transport cradle. Even from his elevated position, Mautaint could see the object's sophisticated construction, precision machined surfaces, fins at the base, a pointed nose cone at the apex. This was no conventional artillery shell or bomb. This was a complete vehicle designed to fly under its own power. The first test launch Mautaint witnessed occurred on a clear morning in July 1942. Prisoners had been confined to their barracks, but the buildings were only 500 meters from the launch complex. The walls were thin. When the rocket fired, the sound was unlike anything Mautaint had experienced in his engineering career or military service. It wasn't merely loud. The ignition created a physical pressure wave that rattled windows and shook the barracks foundation. Mautaint pressed his face against a crack in the wooden wall, desperate to see what was happening. Through the narrow gap, he caught a glimpse of flame, brilliant white and orange, and the rocket rising on a column of fire and smoke. The ascent seemed impossibly fast. Within seconds, the vehicle had climbed beyond his limited field of view. The roar continued for nearly a minute, gradually diminishing as the rocket gained altitude and distance. Then silence, broken only by excited shouts from German technicians and scientists. Mautaint later learned from whispered conversations with other prisoners that the test had been successful. The rocket had reached an altitude of over 80 kilometers and traveled more than 200 kilometers downrange. These numbers defied conventional understanding of ballistics and propulsion. No aircraft could reach such altitudes, no gun could achieve such range. The Germans had created something revolutionary. Not every test succeeded. Mautaint witnessed multiple failures over his 11 months at Peenemünde. Rockets that exploded on the launch pad, destroying the platforms he and other prisoners had spent weeks constructing. Rockets that tumbled out of control seconds after launch, crashing back to Earth in fireballs visible from kilometers away. One particularly catastrophic failure killed 3 German technicians and 6 prisoners who had been working near the launch site. The explosion scattered debris across a square kilometer, some fragments still burning with residual propellant. The failed tests were actually more informative than the successes. Mautaint could observe how German engineers responded, what they modified, which components they replaced. Watching the technical teams analyze failures provided insights into the rocket's construction and operation. He began to understand the vehicle's basic architecture, liquid fuel motors, gyroscopic guidance systems, warhead sections designed to separate during descent. As an engineer, Mautaint recognized he was witnessing history. The rockets represented a technological leap comparable to the invention of powered flight or the internal combustion engine. Whatever their immediate military application, these vehicles would transform warfare and possibly human civilization. The Germans were not merely developing a new weapon, they were creating the foundation for space exploration, intercontinental travel, and technologies that would reshape the 20th century. This realization created a profound moral dilemma. Mautaint was a prisoner, forced to labor on a weapon system designed to kill Allied civilians. Every concrete platform he built, every reinforcement beam he installed, contributed to a device that would rain destruction on London, Paris, or other cities. His engineering expertise was being weaponized against his own nation. Yet he also recognized that intelligence about this program might be invaluable. If Allied forces understood what the Germans were developing, they might be able to counter it, destroy the production facilities, or develop defensive measures. The question was how to gather and transmit that intelligence when every prisoner was watched constantly, and any attempt at communication with the outside world meant immediate execution. Mautaint decided his engineering training provided the solution. He couldn't write notes or steal documents, both actions that would be detected instantly, but he could memorize not just general impressions, but precise technical details, dimensions, proportions, and architectural specifications. His education at École Centrale had included extensive training in spatial visualization and technical drawing. He had learned to look at a structure and mentally translate it into plans and elevations. Now he would apply those skills to military intelligence. Every day became an exercise in covert observation. When working on launch platforms, Mautaint would carefully note dimensions, measuring by pacing distances or using his own body as a reference. A platform 42 paces long meant approximately 30 meters given his stride length. Mounting points spaced at head height provided scale references. The angle of exhaust deflectors could be estimated using shadow positions at known times of day. When rockets were visible, Mautaint committed their appearance to visual memory with the same technique he'd used as a student to memorize architectural drawings. The rocket's length relative to the transport vehicle, the diameter compared to the height of technicians working around it, the size and shape of the fins, the curve of the nose cone. He broke the vehicle into geometric components, cataloging each element separately, then reconstructing the whole from those parts. The memorization technique was mentally exhausting. Each evening, confined to the barracks, Mautaint would lie on his bunk and mentally review everything he'd observed that day. He would visualize the structures he'd worked on, walking through them in memory, checking each dimension and detail. When uncertainty crept in about a specific measurement or proportion, he would plan how to verify it the next day through casual observation that wouldn't attract guard attention. The decision to escape came suddenly. Mautaint had been at Peenemünde for 11 months, accumulating a detailed mental database of the facilities layout, the rockets. The additional increase the rat risk became immediate. The SS began systematically liquidating long-term prisoners at Peenemünde. The official explanation was that the facility was transitioning to a new phase requiring fresh labor. The reality whispered among prisoners was that the Germans feared long-term workers had observed too much. Anyone who had been at Peenemünde longer than 6 months was being transferred, and transferred prisoners were never seen again. Mautaint's name appeared on a transport list scheduled for March 28th. He had perhaps a week to escape or face almost certain execution. The opportunity came during a British air raid on the night of March 23rd. The raid wasn't targeting Peenemünde specifically. RAF bombers were hitting Swinemünde, a port city 20 kilometers south, but the air raid sirens triggered security protocols throughout the region. Guards evacuated prisoners to trenches outside the main compound. In the darkness and confusion, with searchlights sweeping the sky and anti-aircraft guns firing, Mautaint and 3 other French prisoners made their break. They had been planning for this possibility, stealing civilian work clothes, hoarding bits of food, studying guard patterns. When the guards' attention focused skyward on approaching bombers, the 4 men simply walked away from the trench line, moving quickly but not running, trying to appear like workers heading to assigned positions. They reached the perimeter fence at a section where bombing damage from a previous raid had never been fully repaired. The barbed wire had been restrung, but the posts were loose in the sandy soil. Working together, the four men pulled up an entire section of fencing and crawled through. Behind them, the compound remained in chaos, sirens wailing, guards shouting orders, searchlights creating wild shadows. The escapees moved inland away from the coast, navigating by the North Star toward the mainland. They crossed the bridge to the mainland just before dawn, hiding among the shadows of a freight train that was crossing simultaneously. Guards at the bridge checkpoint were focused on checking the train's documentation, not watching the shadows underneath. Once across, the four men separated. Traveling as a group would attract attention. Mautaint headed southwest, alone, into rural Pomerania. The first days were the most dangerous. Mautaint spoke German adequately, but with an obvious French accent. His stolen work clothes were marked with prisoner identification that he had to remove, leaving obvious holes in the fabric. He had no identification papers, no ration cards, nothing that would allow him to travel openly. Survival meant moving only at night, hiding during daylight, and avoiding all contact with German civilians or authorities. He stole food from farms, broke into a shed to steal better clothes, and kept moving southwest toward what he hoped was Allied territory. Luck failed him on the 8th day. Mautaint was hiding in a barn outside Stargard when a Wehrmacht patrol searching for deserters discovered him. The soldiers were not SS or Gestapo, just regular army conducting a routine sweep. Mautaint made a split-second decision that saved his life. Instead of claiming to be an escaped prisoner from Peenemünde, which would have triggered immediate investigation and probable execution, he identified himself as a French POW from a work detail near Poznan, separated from his unit during a transfer. The story was plausible enough. The Wehrmacht had thousands of French POWs scattered across occupied territories, working on farms and construction projects. Administrative records were often incomplete or outdated unless the soldiers specifically checked with Peenemünde. Mautaint's story might hold. The gamble worked. The Wehrmacht patrol processed Mautaint as a recaptured prisoner of war, but didn't connect him to the secret facility on the Baltic coast. He was sent to Stalag Finney B near Marienburg, a standard POW camp, and from there transferred to France as part of a labor reallocation. By May 1943, Mautaint found himself in a work camp near Reims, assigned to agricultural labor, still a prisoner but no longer under the extreme security of Peenemünde. The second escape was easier. By late May 1943, German security in occupied France had become porous as the Wehrmacht struggled with resource shortages and Allied bombing disrupted transportation networks. Mautaint made contact with the French resistance through another prisoner who had connections to the local maquis. On the night of June 3rd, resistance members staged a raid on the work camp, ostensibly to steal supplies, but actually to extract Mautaint and several other prisoners with useful intelligence. The extraction went smoothly. The camp guards, mostly older Wehrmacht reservists, put up minimal resistance. Within hours, Mautaint was hidden in a farmhouse 20 kilometers away. The resistance handlers immediately recognized that Mautaint possessed valuable information. Over the next 3 days, they debriefed him extensively, focusing on German troop dispositions, fortification efforts related to Atlantic wall construction, and any other militarily useful observations. When Mautaint mentioned Peenemünde and the rocket program, the resistance operatives were initially skeptical. Flying bombs, rockets that could reach London. The claims seemed like fantasy or German propaganda, but Mautaint's engineering credentials and the specificity of his descriptions convinced them that at minimum, British intelligence should evaluate his information. Getting Mautaint to Allied lines required careful planning. By June 1943, the resistance had established networks for evacuating downed Allied airmen and high-value intelligence assets, but the routes were dangerous and success was never guaranteed. Mautaint's journey took him southwest through France, moving between safe houses or traveling mostly by night or hidden in farm vehicles. The route avoided major roads and cities, staying in rural areas where German presence was lighter. 2 weeks after leaving Reims, Mautaint crossed into Spain near the Pyrenees, guided by a Basque smuggler who specialized in such transfers. Spain was officially neutral, but tolerated Allied intelligence operations on its territory. British intelligence maintained safe houses in Madrid and Barcelona for processing refugees and escaped prisoners. Mautaint was taken to a British consular office in Barcelona, where he underwent preliminary interrogation by a junior intelligence officer who spoke limited French. The officer dutifully recorded Mautaint's story, but seemed unimpressed. Escaped French POWs arrived regularly, most bringing routine information about German dispositions or atrocity stories useful for propaganda. References to secret weapons were common. Most turned out to be exaggerations or misunderstandings of conventional military equipment. However, Mautaint's engineering background and his insistence on drawing technical diagrams prompted the Barcelona officer to forward the case to London. On June 12th, Mautaint was flown to England aboard a civilian transport aircraft operated by the RAF. He arrived at RAF Hendon and was immediately taken to the interrogation facility in Dover, where Captain Wheeler encountered him 2 days later. Wheeler's initial skepticism about Mautaint's story was understandable. By mid-1943, British intelligence had received dozens of reports about German secret weapons. Most were fabrications, misidentifications, or enemy disinformation. The intelligence services had learned to be cautious about spectacular claims from single sources who couldn't provide corroborating evidence. But Mautaint's drawing changed the equation. Wheeler wasn't an engineer or weapons specialist, but he recognized technical competence when he saw it. The sketch Mautaint had produced wasn't a vague impression or fantasy illustration. It showed specific architectural and engineering details drawn to scale, with annotations indicating dimensions and structural relationships. The level of precision suggested either genuine observation or an extraordinarily elaborate deception. Wheeler excused himself and took the drawing to his superior, Major Thomas Sanderson, who commanded the Dover Interrogation Center. Sanderson studied the sketch for several minutes, then made a phone call to London. Within hours, the drawing was in the hands of air intelligence specialists at the Air Ministry in Whitehall. By evening, it had reached Dr. R.V. Jones, the Assistant Director of Intelligence Science, who had been investigating reports of German secret weapons for over a year. Jones had been tracking fragmentary intelligence about Peenemünde since late 1942. Photographic reconnaissance had shown unusual construction activity on Usedom Island, but analysts couldn't determine the site's purpose. Some intelligence reports mentioned rockets or flying bombs, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. The technical feasibility of long-range rockets was hotly debated. Many senior RAF officers insisted that such weapons were impossible with current technology. Lord Church's chief scientific calculated that rockets carrying significant warheads would require impossibly large vehicles and massive fuel loads. The prevailing view in mid-1943 was that German secret weapons, if they existed at all, were probably advanced aircraft or perhaps pilotless bombers similar to cruise missiles. True ballistic rockets capable of reaching England from continental Europe were considered science fiction. Mautaint's drawing challenged these assumptions. Jones recognized immediately that the sketch showed a vehicle consistent with rocket propulsion. The dimensions, approximately 14 meters long and 2 meters in diameter, matched theoretical calculations for a long-range ballistic missile. The tapered nose section suggested a warhead. The fins at the base indicated aerodynamic stabilization. Most convincingly, the architectural details of the launch platform showed features necessary for liquid fuel rocket operations, flame deflectors, propellant feed lines, and blast protection. Jones requested immediate additional reconnaissance flights over Peenemünde with specific instructions to photograph the areas Mautaint had described. On June 23, 1943, an RAF Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft flew a dangerous, low-level mission over Usedom Island. The resulting photographs were analyzed frame by photo intelligence specialists at RAF Medmenham. What they found corroborated Mautaint's sketch with shocking accuracy. The photographs showed the exact launch platforms Mautaint had described, positioned precisely where he indicated they would be. More dramatically, the photos captured 3 cylindrical objects on the ground near the test areas. The objects matched the dimensions and appearance of the rocket in Mautaint's drawing. Photo interpreters could even identify the black and white test pattern Mautaint had mentioned. This was no longer speculation or single-source reporting. Mautaint's information, combined with photographic evidence, proved that Germany was developing long-range ballistic missiles at an advanced stage of testing. The intelligence reached Churchill's War Cabinet on June 29th. The Prime Minister immediately grasped the strategic implications. If Germany could deploy rockets carrying ton-scale warheads with ranges of several hundred kilometers, London and other British cities would face attacks that no defensive measure could stop. Fighter aircraft couldn't intercept ballistic missiles. Anti-aircraft guns were useless against targets traveling at supersonic speeds. The only way to prevent rocket attacks was to destroy the production and launch facilities before the weapons became operational. Churchill ordered immediate action. Duncan Sandys, the Prime Minister's son-in-law and a military officer with technical background, was appointed to lead a comprehensive investigation into German secret weapons. Sandys had authority to requisition resources from all military and intelligence services. His mandate was clear: determine the nature and scale of the German rocket program, identify production facilities and launch sites, and recommend measures to neutralize the threat. Mautaint was transferred to London and underwent weeks of detailed interrogation by specialists from multiple services. Weapons experts questioned him about the rocket's construction and capabilities. Architectural specialists had him produce detailed drawings of every structure he remembered from Peenemünde. Intelligence analysts cross-referenced his descriptions against other sources, interrogation reports from German prisoners, communications intercepts, and agent reports from occupied Europe. Everything Mautaint said checked out. His descriptions of Peenemunde's layout matched aerial photographs. His technical observations about the rocket were consistent with theoretical missile designs British scientists had studied. Details he provided about test schedules corresponded with increased radio traffic from the Baltic coast that signals intelligence had intercepted but not understood. By late July, Sandys had compiled a comprehensive assessment. Germany was definitely developing long-range ballistic missiles, designated A4 by German engineers, but later known as V2 for Vergeltungswaffe 2 or Vengeance Weapon 2. The missiles were approximately 14 meters long, powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol rockets, and capable of carrying a 1-ton warhead to a range of 300 kilometers. Test launches had achieved increasing reliability, with recent flights successfully demonstrating the basic technology. Production facilities were being established at Peenemünde and possibly at other locations not yet identified. The British response to this intelligence was Operation Hydra, a massive air raid designed to destroy or severely damage the Peenemünde research and testing facility. Planning began in early August 1943 with unprecedented urgency. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, allocated substantial resources to the operation despite his preference for area bombing of German cities. The raid was scheduled for the night of August 17th, 1943, timed to coincide with a full moon that would aid navigation and target identification. The operation would involve 596 heavy bombers, mostly Lancaster and Halifax aircraft, carrying a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The bombing plan was unusually sophisticated. Instead of the standard area bombing approach, Hydra used precision tactics with distinct aim points. The first wave targeted the housing area where German scientists and engineers lived. The intent was not merely property destruction, but killing key technical personnel whose expertise was irreplaceable. The second wave targeted production facilities and workshops. The third wave hit the development works where prototype rockets were being tested. The entire raid was coordinated with a master bomber orbiting over the target, directing aircraft to ensure bombs fell on the designated aim points. To ensure maximum effectiveness, the raid incorporated several deceptions. A diversionary raid on Berlin was launched simultaneously to draw German night fighters away from Peenemünde. Electronic countermeasures jammed German radar. The bombers approached from an unexpected direction, crossing the Baltic Sea rather than flying overland routes that German defenses anticipated. Mautaint was not informed about Operation Hydra in advance, but he was summoned to the Air Ministry on August 19th and shown reconnaissance photographs taken immediately after the raid. The images showed devastating damage. Large sections of Peenemünde were burning or destroyed. The housing areas had been particularly hard hit, with rows of residential buildings reduced to rubble. Production facilities showed massive structural damage. Several launch platforms had been cratered by direct hits. The Air Ministry intelligence officer showing Mautaint the photographs asked if he could identify damage to specific facilities. Mautaint studied the images carefully, using his memory of Peenemunde's layout to orient himself. He pointed out the test stands where he had witnessed rocket launches now damaged beyond immediate use. He identified the assembly halls where rockets were prepared. Their roofs collapsed. He noted that some areas he remembered as critical to the program appeared relatively undamaged, suggesting the bombing had been effective but not totally destructive. The intelligence officer thanked Mautaint and informed him that his information had been instrumental in planning the raid. Without his detailed descriptions of Peenemunde's layout and the rocket program's structure, targeting the raid would have been far less precise. Mautaint's response was complex. He felt satisfaction that his intelligence had enabled a military action against Nazi Germany, but he also understood the human cost. The first bombing wave had specifically targeted the housing areas, meaning German scientists, engineers, and their families had been killed. Many of those civilians, while working for the Nazi regime, were not party members or ideological fanatics, but simply professionals compelled to apply their skills. The moral arithmetic of war was never clean. The raid's effectiveness exceeded initial estimates. Intelligence assessments compiled over the following weeks indicated that Operation Hydra had killed approximately 730 people at Peenemünde, including some of Germany's most talented rocket engineers. Among the dead was Dr. Walter Thiel, the chief propulsion engineer responsible for developing the A4's rocket motor. His death was particularly significant because Thiel possessed unique expertise in liquid fuel propulsion that would take years to replace. The raid also destroyed substantial production equipment and forced the Germans to evacuate much of Peenemundi's operations to less vulnerable locations. However, the raid did not stop the V2 program. German leadership responded to the attack by accelerating production and dispersing facilities to make them less vulnerable to future bombing. The most significant relocation moved rocket production to Mittelbau-Dora, a massive underground factory complex in the Harz Mountains built using concentration camp labor. This dispersal had an unintended and horrific consequence. At Peenemünde, prisoners and forced laborers worked under brutal conditions but were considered valuable assets. The Germans provided minimal food and shelter because skilled workers were difficult to replace. At Mittelbau-Dora, the combination of underground working conditions, inadequate food, and systematic abuse created a death camp masquerading as a factory. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora between 1943 and 1945. Of those, 20,000 died from starvation, disease, beatings, or executions. The V2 rocket program ultimately killed more people during its production than during its deployment as a weapon. Mautaint continued working with British intelligence throughout late 1943 and into 1944. His expertise proved valid as additional suspected textural features associated with rocket production or launching that intelligence analysts without direct experience might miss. In September 1943, Mautaint examined aerial photographs of a suspicious construction site in northern France. The images showed large concrete structures being built in wooded areas. At first, intelligence analysts thought these might be V1 flying bomb launch sites, but Mautaint identified details suggesting they were designed for something larger. The structures included massive blast protection and reinforced storage bunkers consistent with V2 operations. This analysis led to Operation Crossbow, an extensive Allied bombing campaign targeting suspected V-weapon sites throughout France and the Low Countries. Between December 1943 and D-Day in June 1944, Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties against these targets. The bombing campaign consumed enormous resources, diverting aircraft from other missions, but was deemed necessary to prevent or delay V-weapon attacks on England. Mautaint also assisted in interrogating German prisoners captured in North Africa and Italy who had technical knowledge relevant to the secret weapons program. His engineering expertise allowed him to evaluate whether prisoners actually possessed useful information or were fabricating stories to gain better treatment. On several occasions, Mautaint identified prisoners who had worked on projects related to advanced weapons development. These individuals provided additional intelligence that filled gaps in the overall understanding of Germany's secret weapons programs. The first V2 operational launches against Allied targets began on September 8, 1944, 2 months after D-Day. The weapons fell on London and later on Antwerp, killing thousands of civilians. Each attack vindicated Mautaint's warnings, but also reminded him that intelligence, however accurate, could not prevent every tragedy. The V2 was fundamentally different from the V1 flying bomb. The V1 could be shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft guns. The V2, traveling at supersonic speeds and following a ballistic trajectory, was essentially impossible to defend against with 1940s technology. The only countermeasure was destroying the rockets before launch, which required knowing where launch sites were located and maintaining constant air superiority to conduct bombing raids. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched approximately 3,000 V2 rockets at Allied targets. The weapons killed an estimated 9,000 people, including 2,700 in London and thousands more in Antwerp and other locations, the attacks caused tremendous fear because of their unpredictability. Unlike air raids, which could be detected and warned against, V2 attacks gave no warning. The first indication was the explosion itself. The psychological impact was severe, creating a sense of helplessness among civilian populations, yet the V2 never achieved its strategic purpose. The weapons arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. Germany invested the enormous resources in the V2 program, resources that might have been more effectively used producing conventional weapons like fighter aircraft or tanks. The rockets were technologically impressive, but strategically irrelevant. They could not stop the Allied advance or protect German cities from devastating bombing campaigns. Mautaint understood this paradox. His intelligence had enabled attacks on Peenemünde that delayed the V2 program by several months. If the rockets had been operational in mid-1943 instead of September 1944, they might have disrupted D-Day preparations or caused far greater casualties. But the fundamental problem remained. Germany was fighting a war it could not win, and no wonder weapon could change that reality. After the war ended in May 1945, Mautaint returned to France. His work for British intelligence remained classified, so he received no public recognition. French authorities offered him a position in reconstruction planning, utilizing his civil engineering expertise to rebuild the nation's damaged infrastructure. Mautaint accepted and spent the next decade working on bridge reconstruction and urban planning. He spoke rarely about his wartime experiences, the memories of Peenemünde, the forced labor, the technological marvels created through exploitation and suffering remained painful. He maintained occasional contact with British intelligence services, providing technical consultation when questions arose about wartime activities, but gradually faded from that world into private life. The sketches Mautaint drew during his interrogation in Dover were filed in intelligence archives, later transferred to the Imperial War Museum as part of their World War II collection. The drawings remain there today, precise technical illustrations rendered from memory by a man who witnessed history. The story of René Mautaint's sketches illustrates the critical role individual observation played in World War II intelligence. Despite rapid development of technological collection methods like aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, human sources remained irreplaceable. Technology could photograph installations or intercept communications, but only a trained observer on the ground could provide context, explain purpose, and identify significance. Mautaint was not a spy in any conventional sense. He received no training in intelligence gathering. He was not inserted into Peenemünde as part of a planned operation. He was simply a prisoner who happened to possess engineering expertise and realized the significance of what he was witnessing. His decision to memorize technical details, his successful escape, and his ability to communicate what he'd learned to Allied intelligence represented a chain of improbabilities that nevertheless succeeded. The broader historical assessment of Operation Hydra and the Allied campaign against German secret weapons remains debated. Some historians argue the resources devoted to attacking V-weapon sites would have been better used elsewhere, bombing oil refineries or supporting ground operations. Others maintain that the threat posed by V2 rockets justified extraordinary measures, even if the ultimate impact was less than feared. What remains undisputed is that intelligence about the V2 program, particularly from sources like Mautaint, enabled the Allies to understand and partially disrupt a weapon system that represented a genuine technological breakthrough. The V2 was the world's first operational ballistic missile, a direct ancestor of the rockets that would carry satellites into orbit and eventually humans to the moon. German scientists and engineers created this technology under wartime pressure, using methods that included the exploitation of forced labor and concentration camp prisoners. After Germany's defeat, both the United States and Soviet Union competed to capture V2 technology, and the personnel who developed it. Werner von Braun, the chief designer of the V2, surrendered to American forces and later became a central figure in NASA's space program. Hundreds of other German rocket scientists were similarly recruited by the victorious powers, their wartime activities overlooked in exchange for their technical knowledge. The moral complexities of this technology transfer continue to provoke debate decades later. The V2 program was built on slave labor, with more people dying during production than from the weapons deployment. Yet, the technical achievements embodied in the V2 became foundational to Cold War missile programs and eventually peaceful space exploration. Separating the technology from the circumstances of its creation remains ethically problematic. Mautaint's contribution to this history was specific and limited. He observed, remembered, escaped, and reported. His sketches provided Allied intelligence with concrete evidence about Peenemünde at a critical moment when fragmentary reports and aerial photographs left too much uncertainty. The intelligence enabled Operation Hydra, which disrupted but did not destroy the V2 program. The raid killed civilian scientists and forced production into underground facilities where conditions for forced laborers became even more lethal. The chain of consequences flowing from Mautaint's June 1943 interrogation encompasses military operations, technological development, and human suffering on scales that no individual could have anticipated or controlled. Intelligence work operates in this realm of partial knowledge and unintended consequences. Decisions must be made with incomplete information. Actions have effects that ripple beyond immediate intentions. Mautaint provided accurate intelligence about a genuine threat. The response to that intelligence achieved tactical success but created new horrors. No simple moral calculus can balance these outcomes. What remains remarkable is how a single individual's observations committed to memory under conditions of extreme danger and transmitted through improvised escape routes influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels of Allied command. Churchill's war cabinet altered bombing priorities based partly on sketches drawn by a French prisoner of war who had memorized dimensions by pacing distances in a forced labor camp. The improbability of this chain of events highlights how contingent historical outcomes can be. If Mautaint had been executed during the March 1943 prisoner liquidations at Peenemünde, if he had failed to escape, if Wehrmacht patrols had identified him as a Peenemünde fugitive rather than a routine recaptured POW, if the French resistance had dismissed his story as fantasy, if British intelligence had classified his report as unreliable single-source information, the timeline of Allied awareness about V2 rockets would have changed. Operation Hydra might not have occurred when it did, or might have targeted different facilities with different results. Intelligence history is filled with such contingencies, moments when individual initiative or chance events altered larger patterns. The field celebrates dramatic successes like breaking Enigma or running double agents, but much of intelligence work involves fragments like Mautaint's sketches, pieces of evidence that, when combined with other sources, create actionable understanding. The sketches alone proved nothing. Combined with aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, interrogation of other prisoners, and technical analysis, they became part of a comprehensive assessment that justified major military operations. Modern intelligence services study cases like Mautaint's as examples of human intelligence tradecraft, and your source validation. The case teaches that valuable intelligence can come from unexpected sources who lack traditional qualifications. It demonstrates the importance of technical expertise in evaluating observations. Mautaint's engineering background made his testimony credible in ways that vague descriptions from untrained observers would not have been. It illustrates how multiple intelligence disciplines must work together, human sources providing context for technical collection methods and vice versa. The case also highlights persistent challenges in intelligence assessment. How do analysts distinguish accurate reporting from fabrication or misunderstanding? Mautaint's detailed technical sketches and his ability to answer follow-up questions consistently convinced British intelligence he was credible. But the initial skepticism was justified. Many wartime intelligence reports about secret weapons proved unreliable. The difference between signal and noise in intelligence work often becomes clear only in retrospect. For Mautaint personally, the experience defined the rest of his life in ways both obvious and subtle. He carried physical scars from forced labor and the hardships of escape. He carried psychological burdens from witnessing atrocities and contributing, however indirectly, to operations that killed others. The classified nature of his wartime service meant he could not discuss his experiences openly, creating isolation even within communities of veterans who shared other wartime experiences but knew nothing of secret intelligence work. His drawings, preserved in archives, represent a unique historical artifact. They are simultaneously intelligence documents, technical illustrations, and evidence of individual courage and initiative under extraordinary circumstances. Future researchers studying the V2 program or Allied intelligence operations consult these sketches as primary sources. The precision and detail Mautaint committed to memory and later reproduced on paper provide insights that official German documents or Allied technical assessments cannot match. They show what the facility looked like from the perspective of someone who actually built it, who understood its purpose through direct observation rather than abstract analysis. The question that haunts this history is how many other René Mautaints existed but never escaped, never reported, or were never believed. Thousands of prisoners and forced laborers worked on secret German military programs throughout occupied Europe. Most died without transmitting what they knew. Some tried to report but were dismissed as unreliable. Others kept their knowledge silent, fearing retribution against themselves or others if they spoke. The intelligence that reaches decision-makers represents a tiny fraction of what could potentially be known. History is shaped as much by information that never arrives as by intelligence that successfully navigates the pathway from observation to action. Mautaint died in 1937 in Lyon, the city where he was born and trained as an engineer. His obituary mentioned his wartime service and captivity, but nothing about intelligence work or Peenemünde. The full story of his contribution to Allied intelligence efforts remained classified until the 1990s, when British and American governments began declassifying World War II records. Even then, the story attracted little public attention. Mautaint was not a dramatic figure like a spy behind enemy lines or a code breaker at Bletchley Park. He was simply a prisoner who observed, remembered, and reported. Yet his story embodies themes that transcend individual biography. The power of technical expertise applied to non-traditional problems, the courage required to act when action means risking certain death, the complex moral landscape of total war where saving lives in one place may cost lives elsewhere, the contingent nature of historical causation where small actions can cascade into large consequences. These themes make Mautaint's experience worth remembering not as heroic mythology, but as complicated reality, a reminder that historical outcomes emerge from countless individual decisions made under pressure with incomplete information and uncertain consequences. The sketches in the Imperial War Museum archives remain as evidence of one such decision and its rippling effects across time.